the war against ourselves. There is a peculiar form of suffering that has no external cause, no enemy to fight, no circumstance to blame. It is the suffering we inflict upon ourselves, the systematic undermining of our own goals, the deliberate, though often unconscious, destruction of our own possibilities. We want success, but sabotage our opportunities. We crave connection, but push people away. We seek happiness, but make choices that guarantee misery. This is self-sabotage, and it is perhaps the most perplexing and most common form of self-betrayal. Why would anyone work against their own interests? Why would we undermine what we claim to want? Why would we destroy opportunities we have worked hard to create? On the surface, self-sabotage appears irrational, masochistic evidence of some fundamental flaw in our psychology. But beneath the surface, self-sabotage is almost always protective. It serves a function, guards against something worse, maintains a familiar identity even when that identity is painful. The psychoanalyst Karen Horney understood that we often prefer familiar suffering to unfamiliar success because the familiar, even when painful, feels safe. The known devil is better than the unknown angel. We sabotage not because we want to fail, but because success would require us to become someone different, to inhabit an identity we have not yet learned to trust, to leave behind the self we have known, even if that self has been our prison. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate the conditions of past trauma, to return again and again to familiar patterns of pain. We do not do this consciously. We do not wake up deciding to ruin our lives. But something in us pulls toward the familiar, toward the pain we know, toward the failure that confirms what we have always believed about ourselves. The psychology of self-sabotage is the study of how we become our own worst enemy, how we carry within us both the desire for a better life and the mechanisms that ensure we will never have it. The nature of self-sabotage. Psychological foundations. To understand self-sabotage, we must first recognize that it is not a single behavior but a pattern, a constellation of actions and choices that consistently work against our stated goals and values. The person who sabotages relationships does so repeatedly, across multiple partners and situations. The person who undermines their career does so at critical moments when success is within reach. The person who destroys their health does so despite knowing better, despite wanting to change. This repetition is the key to understanding that self-sabotage is not random bad luck or simple poor judgment. It is systematic, predictable, almost as if there is an internal saboteur, a part of the psyche dedicated to ensuring failure. And in a sense there is. What we call self-sabotage is often the work of psychological defenses that once protected us but now imprison us, strategies that were adaptive in childhood but destructive in adulthood. Consider the child who learned that success brings punishment. Perhaps their achievements threatened a parent's fragile ego, and so excellence was met with criticism or abandonment. Perhaps doing well academically meant being separated from peers, becoming isolated, losing the social connection that felt more vital than achievement. That child develops an unconscious association. Success equals danger, and so they learn to fail, not consciously but automatically, protecting themselves from the perceived threat that success represents. This protection continues into adulthood even when the original threat no longer exists. The person is no longer a child dependent on that parent's approval. They are no longer in that peer group where excellence meant exclusion. But the psychological pattern persists because it has become encoded, automatic, part of the structure of the self. They approach success and some internal alarm sounds. Danger, abort, and they find ways to fail, to stay safe by staying small. Self-sabotage also serves to maintain consistency in our self-concept. We develop a story about who we are, and this story, even when negative, provides stability and predictability. I am someone who fails. I am not capable of lasting relationships. I am fundamentally flawed. These beliefs, however painful, organize our experience, tell us what to expect, provide a framework for understanding our place in the world. When reality threatens to contradict this story, when we begin to succeed in ways that do not fit our self-concept, we experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between conflicting beliefs. I believe I am a failure, but I am succeeding. I believe I am unlovable, but this person loves me. I believe I am incapable, but I have just demonstrated capability. This tension is unbearable, and the easiest way to resolve it is not to change the belief, but to change the reality. We sabotage the success, push away the love, undermine the achievement. The dissonance resolves. The familiar self-concept is preserved. Psychoanalytic theory offers another lens for understanding self-sabotage through the concept of the superego, the internalized voice of parental and social judgment. For some people, the superego is punitive, harsh, unforgiving. It does not simply correct behavior. It attacks the self, generates intense guilt and shame, demands suffering as payment for real or imagined transgressions. Self-sabotage becomes a form of self-punishment, a way of satisfying the superego's demand for suffering. The person who sabotages their success may be unconsciously atoning for having more than their parents had, for surpassing someone they were taught to honor, for daring to want something beyond what was permitted in their family system. The success feels like betrayal, like theft, like a crime that demands punishment, and so they punish themselves, ensuring they do not get too far ahead, do not have too much, do not become too different from where they came from. There is also the phenomenon of secondary gain, the hidden benefits that come from failure or dysfunction. The person who cannot keep a job receives attention and care from family. The person who remains in crisis avoids the responsibilities that come with stability. The person who self-sabotages in relationships never has to face the vulnerability of real intimacy. The failure, however painful, provides something, meets some need, serves some function that success would not provide. This is not conscious manipulation. The person is not deliberately choosing failure to gain these benefits, but unconsciously, the psyche notices what failure provides: companionship in misery, freedom from expectation, proof of victimhood, excuse for not trying harder, and organizes behavior to maintain access to these secondary gains, even while the conscious self desperately wants something different. Self-sabotage also protects us from disappointment. If we never try fully, if we always hold something back, if we ensure that our efforts are undermined, then we never have to face the terrifying possibility that our best was not good enough. We can always tell ourselves that we would have succeeded if only we had really tried, if only circumstances had been different, if only we had not sabotaged ourselves. The self-sabotage becomes proof that failure was not inevitable, that we could have succeeded if we had wanted to. This preserves hope, however perverse. Better to believe we are self-defeating than to risk discovering we are genuinely limited. The timing of self-sabotage is also revealing. It often occurs at thresholds, at moments of transition when we are about to move into new territory, new levels of success, new kinds of relationship, new versions of ourselves. These thresholds are psychologically dangerous because crossing them means leaving behind the familiar self, means entering unknown territory where we do not know the rules, where we cannot predict how others will respond, where we might discover things about ourselves we are not ready to face. And so at the threshold, we stumble. The athlete injures themselves before the championship. The student fails the exam that would open new opportunities. The person in a deepening relationship picks a fight that creates distance. The employee makes a costly mistake just as a promotion becomes possible. We retreat from the threshold, return to familiar ground, and tell ourselves we are not ready, not capable, not meant for what lies beyond. The pattern of self-sabotage is therefore not about individual instances of poor judgment or bad luck. It is about an organizing principle in the psyche that prefers the familiar to the possible, that chooses the pain we know over the joy we do not know how to trust, that maintains the self we have been, even when that self has been our tormentor. Self-sabotage and the shadow, the internal saboteur. Carl Jung understood that within every psyche lives what he called a complex, an autonomous splinter of consciousness with its own agenda, its own energy, its own voice. Self-sabotage often originates from what we might call the saboteur complex, a part of the shadow that actively works against the conscious ego's goals and desires. This is not a separate personality in the clinical sense, but it functions with surprising autonomy, as if there were indeed an internal enemy dedicated to our failure. This saboteur is not inherently malicious. It was formed for protective reasons, born from wounds and fears that the psyche could not process in more adaptive ways. Perhaps it developed when achievement was punished, when success brought abandonment, when excellence made us a target. The saboteur learned to keep us small, to ensure we failed before others could reject us, to guarantee disappointment on our own terms, rather than waiting for the world to deliver it. But over time, the saboteur becomes more than protection. It becomes identity. We are not just someone who sometimes undermines themselves. We are the person who always fails, who cannot succeed, who destroys every good thing. The saboteur, initially a defense, becomes the core of who we believe ourselves to be. And from this position, it resists change with surprising strength, because change threatens its existence. Jung wrote about the problem of psychological possession, when a complex takes over consciousness so completely that the person cannot distinguish between themselves and the complex. When possessed by the saboteur, we believe its voice is our voice, its desires our desires, its judgments reality rather than perspective. It tells us we are not ready, not capable, not deserving, and we believe it absolutely. We do not hear these thoughts as coming from a wounded part of ourselves. We hear them as truth about ourselves. The shadow also contains what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of our personality, the capacities we have neglected or denied. For someone who has overdeveloped their thinking function, the inferior feeling function lives in the shadow, erupting at inconvenient moments with overwhelming emotions that sabotage rational plans. For someone who lives entirely in their intuition, the inferior sensation function in the shadow leads to impulsive physical actions, accidents, illnesses that undermine their visionary goals. Self-sabotage often occurs through this inferior function. The person who prides themselves on discipline suddenly becomes wildly impulsive. The person who values independence suddenly becomes desperately needy. The person who is always rational suddenly acts on pure emotion. These eruptions feel alien, feel unlike ourselves, because they are coming from the parts of ourselves we have pushed into the shadow, the undeveloped capacities that demand recognition through disruption. The saboteur also guards what Jung called the treasure in the shadow. Paradoxically, our greatest potential often lives alongside our greatest fear in the unconscious. We sabotage not just because we fear failure, but because we fear success, fear becoming who we might actually be, fear the power and responsibility and visibility that would come with actualizing our potential. The saboteur keeps us from this treasure by ensuring we never get close enough to claim it. Consider the artist who never finishes their work, the writer who never submits their manuscript, the entrepreneur who never launches their business. They may consciously believe they are perfectionists, that they are waiting for the right moment, that they need to develop their skills further. But often, what they are really doing is protecting themselves from the possibility of their own greatness, from having to step into the identity of successful artist or published writer or thriving entrepreneur, identities that feel dangerous, exposing, too much. This fear of one's own potential is what Jung called the fear of individuation, the terror of becoming fully oneself. Individuation requires us to separate from the collective, to claim our unique gifts, to stand out rather than blend in. For many people, this separation feels like death, feels like betrayal of family or culture or the groups we belong to. And so the saboteur protects us from individuation by ensuring we remain small, remain failures, remain safely invisible in the crowd. The saboteur uses shame as his primary weapon. Shame tells us we are fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unworthy, fundamentally wrong. And when we believe this, when shame becomes the lens through which we see ourselves, then self-sabotage makes perfect sense. Why would someone fundamentally flawed deserve success? Why would someone fundamentally unworthy be allowed to have good things? Why would someone fundamentally wrong be permitted to be happy? The sabotage becomes not a failure of willpower, but an expression of what we believe we deserve. Jung believed that the only way to disarm the saboteur is to recognize it, to bring it into consciousness, to engage with it rather than being possessed by it. This means learning to notice when the saboteur is active, when its voice is speaking, when we are about to enact another familiar pattern of self-defeat. But recognition alone is not enough. We must also understand what the saboteur is protecting us from, what wound it is trying to prevent us from experiencing again, what threat it perceives in our success. This requires what Jung called active imagination, a deliberate dialogue with the unconscious. We must ask the saboteur, why are you doing this? What are you afraid will happen if I succeed? What are you trying to protect me from? And we must listen to the answers, which come not as rational thoughts but as images, feelings, memories, bodily sensations. The saboteur has reasons, and until we understand those reasons, we cannot integrate it, cannot transform it from enemy to ally. Integration does not mean eliminating the saboteur. It means recognizing it as a part of ourselves, understanding its protective origins, and then consciously choosing whether to follow its directives or to override them in service of our growth. The integrated person still hears the voice saying you will fail, you are not ready, you should give up now. But they recognize this voice as the saboteur rather than as truth, as a wounded part speaking its fear rather than as reality speaking its verdict. Jung taught that we cannot become whole by eliminating parts of ourselves, even destructive parts. We become whole by integrating them, by bringing them into consciousness where they can be understood and transformed. The saboteur, when recognized and integrated, often reveals itself to have been the guardian of something precious, a part of us that was trying, however clumsily, to keep us safe. The mechanism of self-sabotage, how we defeat ourselves, the mechanisms through which we sabotage ourselves are remarkably consistent across different people and different domains of life. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial because they often operate beneath conscious awareness, executing their destructive work, while we remain convinced we are simply unlucky, simply flawed, simply not meant to succeed. Procrastination is perhaps the most common form of self-sabotage. On the surface, it appears to be simple, poor time management or laziness. But chronic procrastination is rarely about not knowing how to manage time. It is about managing anxiety, about avoiding the emotions that the task triggers. The person procrastinates not because they do not value the goal, but because approaching it activates unbearable feelings: fear of failure, fear of success, fear of judgment, fear of discovering their limitations. Procrastination serves multiple functions. It protects us from having to face whether our best effort is good enough. If we complete the project at the last minute, in a rushed and compromised state, we can always tell ourselves that we would have done better with more time. The procrastination becomes a built-in excuse, a way of preserving the belief in our potential, even while ensuring we never fully actualize it. It also keeps us in a state of perpetual crisis, perpetual emergency, where we are always catching up, always behind, always stressed. This crisis state is familiar to many people, particularly those who grew up in chaotic environments. The calm of being ahead, of having time, of being prepared, this feels unfamiliar, even dangerous. And so we recreate crisis through procrastination, returning to the emotional state we know even though it causes suffering. Perfectionism functions similarly, though it wears the mask of ambition rather than avoidance. The perfectionist sets standards so high that they are impossible to meet, and then uses these impossible standards to justify never completing anything, never putting work into the world, never testing themselves against reality. Perfectionism is not about achieving excellence. It is about avoiding judgment. If nothing is ever finished, nothing can be judged. If the standards are impossibly high, then failure to meet them does not mean we are inadequate, only that we are appropriately ambitious. The perfectionist also uses the pursuit of perfection to procrastinate. There is always one more thing to fix, one more revision to make, one more skill to develop before the work is ready. This endless preparation ensures the work never actually enters the world where it might be criticized, where it might fail to meet expectations, where the gap between vision and execution becomes visible. Self-handicapping is another mechanism, where we deliberately create obstacles to our own success. The student who parties the night before an important exam, the athlete who skips training before a crucial competition, the person who sabotages their health or relationships just as things are improving. These behaviors seem irrational until we understand their function. They provide an external explanation for failure. The failure is not about our inadequacy. It is about the self-imposed handicap. We failed because we did not sleep, not because we are not smart enough. We lost because we did not train, not because we lack ability. This preserves self-esteem in a perverse way. We can maintain the belief in our potential, in what we could have achieved if only we had not sabotaged ourselves. The self-handicapping proves that failure was circumstantial rather than inevitable, that we still might be capable of success if we chose to really try. But we never do really try, because that would remove the excuse and force us to face the truth of our actual capabilities and limitations. Relationships provide a particularly rich domain for self-sabotage. The person who fears abandonment often sabotages relationships by being so demanding, so needy, so vigilant for signs of rejection that they push partners away, thus creating the abandonment they feared. This is what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. The behavior designed to prevent the feared outcome actually causes it, but in a twisted way. This feels safer than waiting passively for abandonment. At least this way, we control when and how it happens. Others sabotage relationships differently, by choosing partners who are unavailable, by picking fights at moments of increasing intimacy, by maintaining distance even while claiming to want closeness. These patterns serve to protect against the vulnerability of genuine intimacy, against the risk of being fully seen and possibly rejected for who we actually are. It is safer to sabotage to ensure the relationship fails for external reasons than to risk having the relationship fail because we are not enough. The timing of self-sabotage is revealing. It often occurs at thresholds, at moments when we are about to achieve something significant, about to move to a new level, about to cross into territory we have never occupied before. The dissertation is abandoned in the final year. The relationship ends just as talk of commitment begins. The business fails just as it is becoming successful. The health regimen is abandoned just as results become visible. These threshold moments are psychologically loaded. They represent the boundary between who we have been and who we might become. Crossing them requires leaving behind the familiar identity, requires inhabiting a new self that we do not yet know how to be. The fear of this transformation often manifests as self-sabotage at precisely the moment when success is within reach. Cognitive distortions support self-sabotage by shaping how we interpret events. All or nothing thinking tells us that anything less than perfection is failure, making us quit when we encounter normal setbacks. Catastrophizing convinces us that failure in one area means total failure as a person, making risk feel impossibly dangerous. Mind reading leads us to assume others are judging us harshly, creating anxiety that manifests as self-sabotage. Discounting the positive ensures we never feel we have achieved enough, never allow ourselves satisfaction, never recognize our successes as real. These distortions are not random errors in thinking. They are protective strategies that maintain familiar patterns. If we believe we are fundamentally inadequate, then cognitive distortions that confirm this belief feel like accuracy rather than distortion. They help us organize experience in ways consistent with our self-concept, even when that self-concept is painful and limiting. The mechanism of self-sabotage is therefore not a single act, but a system, a network of behaviors and beliefs and emotional patterns that work together to ensure we remain within familiar bounds, that we do not risk the unknown, that we maintain the identity we know even when that identity is our prison. Understanding this system is the first step toward dismantling it, toward creating the possibility of different patterns, different choices, different outcomes. Self-sabotage and identity, the existential fear of success. The existentialists understood that self-sabotage is not merely a psychological dysfunction, but an existential strategy, a way of managing the terror of freedom, the burden of possibility, the responsibility of becoming who we might be. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that we are condemned to be free, that we cannot escape the weight of choice, that every moment demands we decide who we will become. And for many people, this freedom is unbearable. Self-sabotage offers escape from freedom through the creation of obstacles that appear to limit choice. When we sabotage ourselves, we can tell ourselves that we had no choice, that circumstances prevented us from succeeding, that we were limited by factors beyond our control. This is what Sartre called bad faith, the denial of our fundamental freedom, the pretense that we are determined rather than choosing. The self-saboteur says, "I would have succeeded if only I had not sabotaged myself," as if the sabotage were external, as if they were victim rather than agent. But the sabotage is a choice, however unconscious, and it serves to deny the more terrifying truth, that we could choose differently, that we could succeed, that nothing external is stopping us. This denial protects us from having to face what Sartre called the anguish of freedom, the vertigo that comes from recognizing that we are the sole authors of our existence, that there is no script to follow, no predetermined path, no guarantee that our choices will lead to happiness or meaning. When we sabotage ourselves, we create the illusion of external limitation. We are not free to succeed because we have sabotaged ourselves. The sabotage becomes a way of escaping the responsibility of freedom. But there is something even more fundamental at work. Søren Kierkegaard identified what he called the despair of possibility, the terror of confronting the vast range of who we might become. When we recognize our full potential, when we see the many possible futures available to us, we can become paralyzed, overwhelmed by the infinity of choice. Self-sabotage narrows possibility back to the familiar. It returns us to the limited self we know, protecting us from the dizzying expanse of who we might be. Kierkegaard also wrote about the despair of not willing to be oneself, the refusal to accept and inhabit one's own being. Self-sabotage is often an expression of this refusal. We sabotage because success would require us to be ourselves fully, to claim our gifts, to inhabit our potential, to become who we actually are rather than who we think we should be or who others expect us to be. This authentic becoming feels dangerous, feels like a kind of death of the false self we have constructed. Martin Heidegger distinguished between authentic and inauthentic existence. Inauthentic existence is when we live according to das Man, the anonymous they, conforming to social expectations, living according to what one does rather than choosing our own path. Many people sabotage themselves when they begin to move toward authentic existence, when they start to claim their unique path, when they risk standing apart from the crowd. The sabotage pulls them back into inauthenticity, back into the safety of conformity, back into the anonymous mass where they do not have to take responsibility for their individual being. This is particularly true for people whose authentic path differs from family or cultural expectations. The child of doctors who wants to be an artist, the child of working-class parents who achieves academic success, the person whose authentic identity contradicts the role their family assigned them. Success in their authentic direction feels like betrayal, like abandonment of where they came from, and so they sabotage. returning to the familiar identity even when that identity does not fit, because the alternative feels like losing their people, losing their place, becoming alien to themselves and others. The existential dimension of self-sabotage also involves what Abraham Maslow called the fear of one's own greatness, what he termed the Jonah complex, after the biblical figure who ran from his calling. Maslow observed that many people are as frightened of their highest possibilities as they are of their lowest. We fear our strength as much as our weakness, our intelligence as much as our stupidity, our beauty as much as our ugliness. To claim our greatness would mean accepting responsibility for using it, accepting the obligations that come with capability, accepting the visibility and vulnerability of standing in our full power. Self-sabotage protects us from this burden. If we fail, if we remain small, if we never actualize our potential, then we are not responsible for what we might have done with our gifts, not accountable for the difference we might have made, not obligated to use our capacities in service of something larger than ourselves. The sabotage keeps us safe from our own greatness and all that it would demand of us. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, wrote that the primary human drive is not pleasure, but meaning, that we can endure almost anything if we have a why. But meaning brings responsibility. When our life has meaning, when we are called to something, when we recognize our purpose, we become accountable for pursuing it. Self-sabotage can be a flight from meaning, from the weight of a calling we feel unequal to, from the responsibility of a purpose that demands more than we believe we can give. There is also the existential fear of completion. As long as we are striving, failing, sabotaging, and trying again, we are in process, in becoming, not yet finished. But success means completion, means having arrived, means being rather than becoming. And being is terrifying because it is final, because it reveals what we are rather than what we might be. The person in perpetual self-sabotage never has to face this finality, never has to be anything definite, can always remain pure possibility, pure potential, never actualized and therefore never limited by actuality. Camus wrote about the absurd, the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's indifference. Self-sabotage can be a response to the absurd, a way of avoiding having to create meaning in a meaningless universe. If we sabotage ourselves, if we remain in failure, we can tell ourselves that we would have found meaning if only we had succeeded. We preserve the fantasy of potential meaning, while never having to face whether we can actually create it. The existential work required to overcome self-sabotage is therefore not about techniques or strategies, but about accepting responsibility for our freedom, embracing the burden of possibility, choosing to become ourselves despite the terror of authenticity. It requires facing that we are not determined by our past, by our circumstances, by our wounds, that we are choosing moment by moment who we will become. And in that recognition lies both the source of self-sabotage and the path beyond I, the neuroscience of self-defeating behavior. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the neural architecture underlying self-sabotage, and what we discover reveals that self-defeating behavior is not simply a failure of willpower or a moral weakness, but involves specific patterns of brain activity that help explain why these patterns are so persistent and so resistant to conscious intervention. At the center of self-sabotage is a conflict between brain systems that operate on different timescales and with different priorities. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is responsible for long-term planning, for delayed gratification, for keeping future goals in mind and organizing behavior toward them. This is the part of the brain that wants to succeed, that sets goals, that understands intellectually what needs to be done. But the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and the ventral striatum, operates on immediate emotional responses and short-term rewards. This system registers threat, generates anxiety, seeks immediate relief from discomfort. When we approach a threshold of success, when we are about to take a risk or enter unfamiliar territory, the amygdala activates, signaling danger. This is not rational analysis. It is automatic threat detection based on learned associations, on past experiences, on deeply encoded patterns. The conflict between these systems is not equal. The limbic system, being evolutionarily older and operating automatically, often overrides the prefrontal cortex, especially under stress or when cognitive resources are depleted. This is why we sabotage even when we know better, even when we can rationally explain why we should not. The knowledge lives in the prefrontal cortex, but the behavior is driven by limbic responses that operate beneath conscious awareness and control. Research on habit formation reveals that self-sabotage becomes automatized through repetition. Each time we approach success and pull back, each time we create crisis through procrastination, each time we sabotage a relationship at a moment of intimacy, we strengthen neural pathways in the basal ganglia that encode this pattern as habit. Over time, the behavior requires less conscious deliberation. It happens automatically, triggered by specific cues, executed without conscious choice. This automatization is adaptive for behaviors that serve us. We want some actions to become habitual, so we do not have to constantly think about them. But when self-defeating behaviors become automatic, we lose the opportunity for conscious intervention. The sabotage happens before we recognize what we are doing, before we can choose differently. The neural pathway has been so deeply carved through repetition that it activates instantly, bypassing conscious decision-making. The neuroscience of trauma also illuminates self-sabotage. People who experienced early trauma show altered connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex, which should regulate emotional responses, has weaker inhibitory control over the amygdala. This means that threat responses activate more easily and are harder to regulate consciously. What would be a manageable challenge for someone without trauma history becomes overwhelming for someone whose neural architecture has been shaped by early adverse experiences. For these individuals, success genuinely feels dangerous because their nervous system has learned that visibility, achievement, standing out can bring harm. The amygdala sounds alarms that the prefrontal cortex cannot fully override. The sabotage is not irrational from the perspective of a nervous system shaped by trauma. It is protective, keeping the person small and invisible and safe according to the rules that trauma taught them. The default mode network, active when we are at rest and engaged in self-referential thinking, also plays a role in self-sabotage. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in thinking about ourselves and our future. In people prone to self-sabotage, this network shows altered patterns, particularly rumination on negative self-concepts and catastrophic future scenarios. The brain rehearses failure. It generates vivid simulations of things going wrong, of success leading to disaster, of achievement bringing rejection or exposure. These mental simulations are not random. They are based on past experiences, on internalized beliefs, on fears that have been encoded in memory. And because the brain does not distinguish sharply between imagined and real experiences, these simulations create genuine anxiety, genuine fear, that then drives avoidant behavior and self-sabotage. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with motivation and reward, shows dysregulation in patterns of self-sabotage. Normally, dopamine activates in anticipation of reward, creating motivation to pursue goals. But in people who chronically self-sabotage, the dopamine response to anticipated success is often blunted. They do not feel the motivational pull toward positive outcomes with the same intensity that others do. Instead, they may experience dopamine release in response to familiar patterns of crisis and drama, creating biochemical reinforcement for self-defeating behaviors. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in error detection and conflict monitoring, shows hyperactivity in many people who self-sabotage. This region constantly signals that something is wrong, that the current state is inadequate, that correction is needed. This hyperactivity creates chronic dissatisfaction, a sense that nothing is ever good enough, that any achievement is insufficient. This internal alarm never turns off, driving perfectionism and procrastination as the person tries unsuccessfully to meet impossible internal standards. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates stress hormones, shows chronic activation in people with persistent self-sabotage patterns. Cortisol levels remain elevated, creating a state of perpetual stress that impairs prefrontal function, reduces cognitive flexibility, and makes it harder to override automatic patterns. The person is trying to change their behavior while their neurochemistry is working against them, while their stress response is impairing the very brain regions they need for self-regulation. Research on neuroplasticity offers hope. The brain retains the capacity to change throughout life. When self-sabotaging behaviors are interrupted, when new patterns are practiced consistently, neural pathways can be rewired. The hyperactive amygdala can be calmed through repeated experiences of safety in situations that previously triggered fear. The weak connection between prefrontal cortex and limbic system can be strengthened through practices that enhance self-regulation. But this rewiring is not quick. It requires thousands of repetitions, requires consistently choosing different responses despite the pull of habit, requires building new neural pathways while the old ones are still active and still strong. The person must practice approaching success without sabotaging, practice tolerating the anxiety that success triggers, practice inhabiting new identities before the neural architecture fully supports those identities. Mindfulness practices have been shown to enhance prefrontal control over limbic responses, to reduce amygdala reactivity, to change the default mode network's patterns of self-referential thinking. Therapy, particularly approaches that involve gradual exposure to feared situations and conscious processing of trauma, can help rebuild the neural circuits that trauma disrupted. But all of this requires time, requires patience, requires the person to persist in new behaviors even when every instinct screams to return to familiar patterns. The neuroscience of self-sabotage thus reveals that we are not simply choosing to defeat ourselves. We are enacting patterns that are encoded in neural architecture, patterns shaped by experience and reinforced through repetition, patterns that operate largely outside conscious awareness and control. This is not excuse. We still have agency, still have the capacity to choose differently, but it is explanation, revealing why change is so difficult, why self-sabotage persists despite our conscious desire to stop, why willpower alone is rarely sufficient to overcome deeply ingrained patterns. Beyond self-sabotage, integration, and self-compassion. If self-sabotage is so deeply wired into our psychology, if it is encoded in neural pathways and protected by unconscious defenses, if it serves functions and guards against threats both real and imagined, then what hope exists for liberation from it? This is the question that haunts anyone who has watched themselves repeatedly undermine their own goals, who has recognized the pattern but felt powerless to change it, who has promised themselves this time will be different, only to find themselves enacting the same self-defeating behaviors once again. The path beyond self-sabotage begins not with fighting it, but with understanding it. We must approach our own self-defeating patterns with curiosity rather than condemnation, with investigation rather than judgment. Why do I do this? What is this behavior protecting me from? What would I have to face if I allowed myself to succeed? These questions, asked with genuine openness, can reveal the hidden logic of self-sabotage, the ways it has been trying, however clumsily, to keep us safe. Jung's approach to working with the shadow is crucial here. We cannot eliminate the saboteur through warfare against ourselves. That only creates more internal division, more fragmentation, more power in the hands of what we are fighting. Instead, we must integrate, must bring the saboteur into consciousness, must understand its origins and its purposes. The part of us that sabotages was formed for reasons, developed in response to real threats or perceived dangers. and it continues because those threats still feel real even when circumstances have changed. Integration requires dialogue with the saboteur rather than condemnation of it. When we notice ourselves beginning to sabotage, we can pause and ask, what are you afraid will happen if I succeed? Often, the answers that emerge are revealing. I will be alone. People will expect more from me than I can sustain. I will discover I am not actually capable. I will have to leave behind who I have been. These fears, when brought into consciousness, lose some of their power because we can examine them, can question whether they are still valid, can develop responses to them. Self-compassion, as developed by researcher Christine Neff, is essential in this work. Self-sabotage is often driven by harsh self-judgment, by the belief that we do not deserve success, by the internalized voice that attacks us for our failures and our limitations. When we can meet ourselves with compassion, when we can recognize that self-sabotage is not evidence of our badness but of our woundedness, something shifts. We are no longer fighting ourselves. We are caring for the wounded parts that have been driving the self-defeating behavior. This compassion must extend to understanding why the sabotage made sense, why it developed, what it was protecting us from. The child who learned that success brought punishment was not weak for developing self-sabotage. They were adapting to a dangerous environment in the only way available to them. The adult who continues the pattern is not defective. They are simply enacting a strategy that once worked but has outlived its usefulness. Compassion allows us to honor the protective function while choosing differently in the present. But understanding and compassion alone are not sufficient. We must also practice new behaviors, must build new neural pathways, must learn through repeated experience that success does not bring the disasters our nervous system predicts. This requires what psychologists call graduated exposure, slowly approaching the things that trigger our sabotage patterns while managing the anxiety that arises, proving to our nervous system that we can tolerate success, that we can survive visibility, that we can inhabit new identities. This practice must be incremental. We cannot expect to suddenly stop sabotaging after years or decades of the pattern. Instead, we start small. We notice when the sabotage impulse arises, and we pause before acting on it. We complete one small project without undermining it. We stay in a relationship through one moment of increasing intimacy without creating distance. Each small success teaches the nervous system that the feared outcomes do not materialize, gradually building tolerance for success and reducing the automatic sabotage response. Therapy can provide crucial support in this work, particularly approaches that address both the unconscious origins of self-sabotage and the present-day patterns. Psychodynamic therapy explores the historical roots, the early experiences that taught us that success was dangerous. Cognitive behavioral approaches identify and challenge the distorted thinking that maintains self-sabotage. Somatic therapies work with the body's stored responses, helping to release the physical patterns of bracing and withdrawal that accompany self-sabotage. The existential work is equally important. We must face that we are choosing our sabotage, that however unconscious the choice feels, we retain agency. This is not about self-blame. It is about reclaiming power. When we recognize that we are choosing, however automatically, we also recognize that we can choose differently. We are not victims of our patterns. We are authors who have been writing the same story, but who can, with effort and awareness, begin to write a different one. This requires accepting the burden of freedom, accepting that we are responsible for who we become regardless of what shaped us. Our past does not determine our future unless we allow it to. Our wounds do not doom us to repeat the same patterns unless we refuse to do the work of healing. This acceptance is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means we cannot blame our failures on circumstances or on our psychology. Liberating because it means we have the power to change. We must also grieve. Self-sabotage often protects us from grief, from having to mourn what we did not get in childhood, from facing that we cannot go back and have a different past, from accepting that some wounds cannot be fully healed and some needs will never be met. When we can allow this grief, when we can feel the sadness of what was lost without trying to fix it through present-day sabotage, we free ourselves to live in the present rather than endlessly reenacting the past. The path beyond self-sabotage is therefore not a single breakthrough, but a gradual process of increasing consciousness, building new capacities, practicing different responses, developing compassion for ourselves, accepting responsibility for our choices, and grieving what cannot be changed while changing what can be. It is difficult work, often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but it is possible. Thousands of people have freed themselves from self-sabotage patterns. The neural pathways can be rewired. The unconscious can be brought into consciousness. The wounded parts can be healed or at least understood and integrated. Conclusion: the psychology of self-sabotage reveals one of the great paradoxes of human existence. We are capable of being our own worst enemy, of systematically undermining what we consciously desire, of creating the very failures we most fear. This capacity is not a flaw in our design. It is a feature of our complexity, evidence that we contain multiple parts with different agendas, that our conscious desires can conflict with unconscious needs, that what once protected us can later imprison us. Self-sabotage is not random or mysterious. It follows patterns, serves functions, operates according to internal logic, even when that logic is based on outdated beliefs or childhood wounds. We sabotage to maintain familiar identities, to avoid the anxiety of success, to protect against the vulnerability of being fully seen, to punish ourselves for imagined sins, to stay loyal to family systems that taught us to stay small, to escape the burden of our own potential. Understanding these mechanisms does not immediately free us from them, but it transforms our relationship to our self-defeating patterns. We can see them as symptoms rather than as character flaws, as protective strategies rather than as evidence of our inadequacy, as patterns that developed for reasons rather than as proof that we are fundamentally broken. The path beyond self-sabotage is not about becoming perfect or eliminating all self-defeating tendencies. It is about developing awareness, about recognizing patterns as they emerge, about understanding what drives them, about building the capacity to choose differently even when every instinct pulls us toward the familiar pattern. It is about integration rather than elimination, about bringing the saboteur into consciousness where it can be understood rather than leaving it in the shadow where it operates with autonomous power. This work requires patience and self-compassion. We have likely been sabotaging ourselves for years or decades. The neural pathways are deeply carved. The unconscious beliefs are firmly established. The protective functions are strongly motivated. Change will be gradual, will involve setbacks and relapses, will require us to persist even when progress seems impossible. But change is possible. The brain retains plasticity. The unconscious can be brought into consciousness. The shadow can be integrated. The wounded parts can heal or at least be understood and accepted. We are not doomed to repeat our patterns forever. We can learn, can grow, can develop new capacities, can choose differently. The person who overcomes self-sabotage does not become someone who never feels the pull towards self-defeat. They become someone who recognizes that pull, understands it, and chooses not to follow it. They still hear the voice saying, "You are not ready. You do not deserve this. You should give up now." But they recognize this voice as the saboteur, as a wounded part speaking its fear, rather than as truth about their capabilities or worth. Self-sabotage is ultimately about fear. Fear of our own power, fear of visibility, fear of failure, fear of success, fear of becoming who we might actually be. The path beyond self-sabotage is the path of courage, of choosing to face these fears rather than arranging our lives to avoid them, of risking the unknown rather than remaining in familiar suffering. We are not our self-sabotage. We never were. We are the consciousness that can witness the saboteur, that can understand its origins, that can choose moment by moment whether to follow its directives or to override them in service of our growth and our authentic being. If this exploration of self-sabotage has helped you recognize patterns in your own life, if you see yourself in these descriptions of how we defeat ourselves, know that recognition is the crucial first step. Self-sabotage thrives in unconsciousness, in the belief that we are simply unlucky or incapable. By seeing the pattern clearly, you have already begun to change your relationship to it. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the hidden dynamics of human psychology with depth and honesty, that does not offer quick fixes but invites genuine understanding of why we do what we do. Share this with someone who might be struggling with self-sabotage, who needs to know that these patterns are not character flaws but protective strategies that can be understood and changed. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with self-sabotage, with the patterns you recognize in yourself, with what has helped you begin to change them. This community exists for those willing to look honestly at the ways we defeat ourselves, to bring consciousness to what operates in shadow, to do the difficult work of transformation. Remember, you are not broken. You are not uniquely flawed. You are human, carrying wounds and protective strategies like every human does. Self-sabotage is not evidence of your inadequacy. It is evidence of your adaptation to difficult circumstances, of your psyche's attempt to keep you safe, even when safety has come at the cost of your growth. The patterns can change. The neural pathways can be rewired. The unconscious can be made conscious. You can learn to recognize the saboteur's voice and choose not to follow it. You can build tolerance for success, for visibility, for inhabiting your full potential. This work takes time and requires support, but it is possible. You deserve success. You deserve happiness. You deserve to live a life not limited by old wounds and outdated protections. The saboteur served you once, but you do not have to serve it forever. Choose consciousness. Choose compassion. Choose courage. And know that you are not alone in this struggle or in the journey beyond it.